Okay, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV as we continue the countdown to our first event of 2024, which will be the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show that's held at the Telford International Centre in the middle of February, which is only about a couple of weeks away now, and you'll be able to see all of these fantastic machines that were on display over the course of the 2 days right here on my YouTube channel soon after that event. So make sure that you hit that subscribe button in order that you don't miss out on this fantastic event. Although up until we do get the chance to attend that Telford Classic event, we're going to continue to check out more Twinshock bikes, and in this featured video here we're going to take a look at some Austrian built KTM machines, starting with this 1980s example belonging to classic racer Kevin Thornton. Now, as far as I can remember, this is a 1980 or possibly even a 1981 125, and I do remember Kevin telling me that he bought this bike from a seller in Germany some years ago, and apart from one or two little tweaks he made just to get the bike running better, this is more or less in the same condition that the bike was in when Kevin first purchased it. So as far as I can make out, when you move around this bike, it still more or less has all of its original 1980s parts, apart of course from a Mikuni carburetor, which seems to have been swapped for the bike's original Bing item. And also you can see that this little 125 even still has its factory shocks fitted on the rear, which again is a quite rare sight for one of these older KTMs, and in fact it's quite rare to even see one of these Twinshock KTMs in a racing paddock, let alone one that's about to take part in a race event. And even for the early 1980s, this was still a pretty good little two-stroke motor, which naturally was the baby brother of some of the other models in the KTM range at that time, because I think you could have this light and flickable 125, or even a 175, a 250, or a 400. But if you did have a big enough pair of cojones and you could handle the power, you could also opt for the big mama of them all, the mighty 495, which we'll also have a look at later on in this video. Although apart from that carburetor swap, it's quite hard to find any other parts that aren't stock on this bike, although the handlebars do look like modern Renthos. But without a doubt, this is a rare and very fine example of one of these long-lost KTM baby Twinshockers, because these Austrian built machines are becoming very rare to see in the paddocks, or like I said, even on the track. So it's fair play to Kevin for continuing to display it and ride it around the track. But I was actually quite fortunate to spot this bike as I was wandering around the paddock at the Westmoreland Golden Jubilee Scramble here back in 2021, as these clips were taken in the very early hours of the morning, and that's even before the sun had broken through the skies. But if you take a look at the racing footage from this 2021 event, you'll be able to see Kevin in action on this bike in the Twinshock 125 class. But I expect that back in the day, these little 125 KTMs would have done quite well in the smaller 125 class, because they certainly did have a relatively light tubular steel chassis, and of course that perky 125 two-stroke motor, and what was regarded at the time decent suspension on the front and at the back. And because this was a lighter and much more flickable 125 model, the old school drum brakes were more than adequate to control this bike's stopping distance. But another fine example of a 1980s 125. Okay, so our next vintage Twinshock KTM is this quite nice 1979 GS80 125 Enduro bike that I spotted at last year's Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. And this again is a fine example of one of these smaller Enduro models, which was actually offered up for sale on the weekend of that show, and being sold for what I thought was a very fair price at only £4,250. Now, as you can gather, this lovely machine has just undergone a complete and full restoration using loads of brand new old stock KTM factory components, and many of these parts were sourced from Andre Horvath at his Enduro Classicer franchise, who of course specialises in genuine original spares for these older KTM. So Andre is another very good contact to keep handy if you're looking for rare original bits and pieces for your old KTM. But basically every single part of this bike has had a complete refurbishment, beginning with its chassis, which was naturally blasted and then fully repainted. But you have to admit, the owner of this bike has certainly made a first-class job of its restoration, and I even think that this bike looks a lot better than it did while it was sitting in a dealership window way back in 1979. And of course, when all of the other parts on the bike were being refurbished, this engine here also had a full strip down and rebuild, and during its reconstruction it received a brand new piston and liner inside the barrel, and a refurbished crankshaft with new big end and small end bearings, and of course a host of other internal components to replace the ones that didn't measure up to the quality control when it came to the engine's rebuild. So what the bike eventually ended up with was essentially a brand new 125 KTM two-stroke engine that was now once more ready to take to the track. But one other part that was fitted to this motor during its construction was to fit a proper power dynamo and a 12-volt power supply in order to power the ignition and, of course, the bike's front and rear lighting system. Now, up at the bike's front end, the original Italian Marzocchi forks were completely stripped and then rebuilt with new internals like seals and bushes, etc. So these Marzocchis were just about ready again for their next Enduro or Classic Scramble event. But here on the back of our GS KTM, these piggyback Marzocchi rear shocks were also given the very same treatment as the front end, and these were completely dismantled and rebuilt with brand new parts. And even these rear and the front wheel as well are still the original 1979 parts, but these have been repolished and a brand new set of stainless steel spokes laced onto the original front and rear hubs to make all of the running gear on the chassis on this bike fit and proper once again. Now, the fuel tank was also stripped of its old patina and then completely repainted before finishing it off with the proper KTM World Championship graphics. And apart from maybe these more modern style alloy handlebars and new control cables, this 1979 GS model is probably one of the finest examples I've ever seen in a long time, and it would certainly make a fantastic bike to have a bit of fun on at a vintage scramble or enduro event at the weekend. Although whether the actual owner of this bike managed to sell the machine on the day of the show, I don't actually know, but to tell the truth, I even thought about making an offer on this bike myself, because it was such a nice looking machine that was going for very little money, and I just couldn't help but think that surely this must have cost the owner a lot more in time and money to actually restore the bike than he was actually asking for it, because at around £4,250, it surely got to be worth that kind of money every day of the week. But once again, this is another fantastic example of an extremely rare 1979 GS80 125 KTM. Okay, so this next Austrian KTM is a 400 model, and this is another bike that I spotted while I was making my way through the paddock while I was attending a charity scramble event in Northern Ireland in 2018. But again, and as in our previous examples, another model that's in fairly good original condition. So even although we do go on about these bikes being a bit elusive to find at vintage scrambles meetings, many of the bikes that we're actually coming across, as you can see, are still in very good nick, considering most of them are now at least 40 odd years old. But I'm in guessing mode once again, and I expect that this bike could possibly be a 1980 or more than likely another 1981 bike, which appears to have pretty much all of its original factory parts. And this 400 two-stroke power plant was yet another belter of an engine, and these did make a fantastic Club Riders motor, because naturally it had a bit more grunt than its younger siblings like the smaller 125 or 250 bikes, but it was still just about quick enough to keep up with those bigger open class bikes of its day. But if you wanted to pass those bikes and hit the front and be Johnny Holeshot, then you'd probably have to move up to the daddy of them all, the big 495, which of course was one of the best open class racers of that 1980s period. But naturally, this homemade primary drive sprocket cover isn't, of course, a factory KTM item, because one of the rules of Twinshock Classic Racing in Northern Ireland is that you must have a sprocket cover on the primary drive to race your bike at their event. So the bike's owner has obviously fabricated this improvised part. And once more, and as in our previous machines, this bike here appears to still have its original shocks with their remote reservoirs there tucked up underneath that rear mudguard, which, as I remember, these shocks weren't that bad for a 40-odd-year-old twin shocker of that period. But we still have the original Bing carburetor here on our 400 KTM, which, as I mentioned previously, often got swapped for a Mikuni or something similar. So it's quite good to see these original parts still intact. And it also appears that the stock KTM tailpipe and its original expansion chamber exhaust have survived all of those hard work of years on the track, but the bikes handlebars and maybe other parts like its grips and controls appear to have been changed since the 1980s, which of course is understandable if the bike's still being raced on the track. But other parts like chains and sprockets obviously will have also been changed regularly throughout its lifetime as well. But once again, another very nice original looking bike, and actually one that I did get the chance to see racing on the track over that charity scramble weekend event, and by all accounts the bike and its rider put on a very good show in the Twinshock class. But as I mentioned, although it's quite hard to see these old KTM Twinshockers out and about in their natural habitat, you've certainly got to hand it to the riders and owners of these Austrian built off-roaders for persevering with them and trying to keep them competing against the might of the Japanese and other European classics. But certainly another fine example of a 400 KTM. So as we move on, our next classic KTM Twinshocker is this lovely 1974 250 GS Enduro bike, and yet again this is another quality machine that I came across at last year's Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. And as in our previous Enduro machine, this bike here has also undergone a full nut and bolt restoration, and as you can see, it's now in better than brand new condition, sitting proudly here on the Classic Dirt Bike magazine stand at the 2023 show. Now, back in 1974, this 250 was kind of seen as a transitional model because it was still using the older 250 two-stroke engine from 1973, which was now, of course, bolted into the brand new 74 chassis, which was also named the Turbino because it had relatively narrow diameter frame tubes that ran from the footrests right up to the seat rails. So the bike's current owner is Mauro Cipolat Gotet, who bought this bike back in 1988, and he used it quite regularly at various scrambles and enduro events while he was staying at his family home in northeast Italy. And many years after, when Mauro returned to the UK, he then decided to lavish some well-earned cash on his cherished race bike and treat it to a full restoration. Now, although the bike still had most of its original parts intact, after its 50 years of service, almost every single component required some kind of refurbishment, but the end product is that we now have a better than brand new original 74 GS KTM 250 Enduro bike. But the main reason for this bike being on display at the show and on the Classic Dirt Bike magazine stand was that this machine was to be the centerpiece for their spring issue of their publication in 2023, where they did a complete and full feature on this bike and its restoration. So maybe if you think you might be interested in reading about the story and how this bike all came together, then you can simply go to the Classic Dirt Bike magazine webpage and order a back copy of issue number 62, where you can of course read the full story of what was done on this bike to bring it back to this original condition. But the quality of the work that's gone into restoring this 1970s machine is first class, and certainly a credit to Mauro and the many long hours of hard work that he put into its refurbishment, because as far as I'm aware, he's taken all of the original 74 parts that KTM fitted to the bike at the factory and either restored them or at the very least cleaned or reworked them to make them functional again. And even parts like the lighting, switchgear and handlebars and grips are still the bike's original 74 factory fitted items. But as we move on to the bike's power plant, another little bit of trivia about this 250 two-stroke motor was that this was reputed to be KTM's first ever in-house built motocross engine, which, as you can see, were originally painted in this black colour before then swapping to the much more now familiar silver crankcases on their future models. And also, as you're more than probably aware, this 74, or should I say 73 engine also had a 6-speed gearbox, so there was certainly no shortage of cogs to select on this engine, and your left foot was certainly kept very busy tapping away at this little speed shifter. But without doubt, the story of this bike is quite intriguing and interesting, and it's certainly worth a read if you can lay your hands on one of those back copies of Classic Dirt Bike magazine issue 62, where you can read all of the details of the background of the bike and its restoration. But alternatively, I do already have another video of this bike posted on my channel with a lot more detail in it, so it's really just a case of visiting my channel and then searching for a 1974 KTM GS250, and you'll come across it quite easily. Although without doubt another rare and exceptional example of a classic KTM twin shocker, and for me personally probably one of the best examples I've ever seen of a 250 twin shock Enduro from 1974. Now, of course, we couldn't conclude our brief look at KTM twin shockers without mentioning the big daddy of them all, the mighty 1981 495 ballistic missile. But this example here belongs to Scottish twin shock racer Brian Allardyce, and this is a bike that Brian also did a full restoration on a few years back. But these awesome 495s, of course, were bikes for the big boys of the early 1980s who raced these open class machines against some of the best of the Japanese big four of Kawasaki, Honda, Suzuki and Yamaha. But of course not forgetting the mighty 1981 490 Michael, which is still regarded by many as possibly the best open class twin shock race bike ever made. Although when it came down to outright speed and power, then the big 495 KTM would probably secure that title, because although it didn't have the sharp handling of the big Michael's chassis, certainly the 495's reed valve two-stroke motor had a lot more power than your average rider could actually handle, which of course many club riders did find out to their cost when they turned the gas tap on to full in an effort to try and tame this big 495 beast. Because if you weren't familiar with the grunt and the way that the power was delivered by this explosive power plant, then you could certainly see yourself ending up with another brown trouser embarrassment when it caught you unawares. And again, I'm pretty sure that you're aware that these 1981 495 KTMs still hold the world record of being the fastest stock dirt bike ever made. I do remember that story about the late and great Rick Simon and some of his bike mad pals who took a stock 495 twin shocker onto a dry lake bed, and after a bit of gearing changes to the primary drive and rear sprockets and a bit of jet swapping on the motor's carburetor, they took their 495 to a top speed of 123.75 miles an hour. A record, as far as I'm aware, still stands to this very day. So if somebody's looking for a bit of a challenge, then maybe the big 490 Micro would be a good contender for that title, but certainly don't use a modern day four-stroker if you want to be in with a shout, because those engines have far too many moving parts bouncing around that something is bound to go bang. But you can certainly see, and as in those couple of other previous bikes that we've featured, that this big 495's also been restored to a very high standard, with many of its stock original parts being either refurbished or simply replaced, because you can still pick up new old stock components for these older Twinshock KTMs, because I do remember Brian telling me that he also sourced quite a lot of new old stock 495 parts from Andrew Horvath at his Enduro Classicer website. Now, one of the parts that Brian was finding a bit hard to locate was to find an original expansion chamber for this bike, and eventually he did manage to source this beautifully sculpted Scalvini race pipe that was made in Italy. And this pipe here is a direct bolt-on replacement for what would have been the original Austrian KTM item. And in my opinion, this pipe here looks so much better as well, because rather than it being painted in matte black, it's just been kept in its raw constructed state, where you can see all of the hard work and the engineering that's gone into constructing this lovely pipe. And as we move on to the front of the bike's suspension, now the original parts on the bike's front forks were all refurbished, again with new seals and springs and bushes as well. And as I remember, I'm pretty sure that the fork stanchions themselves were also remachined in order to remove some chips or pits on their surfaces, and so as not to damage those brand new fork seals. But both the front and the rear hubs on this 495 also were given a new lease of life, with some brand new spokes that were relaced onto the bike's original alloy wheels. And of course, KTM did use a substantial amount of magnesium on their Twinshock dirt bikes, and this rear brake backplate was also forged in that exotic material. But if you'd like to know the full story behind this particular 495 rocket ship, then there is already a full video on the restoration of this bike here on my channel, which is certainly worth a look if you're into your older Twinshock KTMs. But as I mentioned earlier, exactly why you very seldom see these 495s taking part in vintage or classic scrambles nowadays is certainly a bit of a mystery, because let's face it, they weren't exactly slow or even lacked power, which may even be one of the dominating factors why we don't see these 81 open class racers nowadays, because as I mentioned, they may have lacked the sharp handling that the 81 490 Micro chassis had, but when it came to horsepower, then these 495s had it in absolute bucket loads, which was probably more power than your average rider could actually handle. And you had to be a special kind of lunatic to hold that throttle wide open in top gear on one of these bullets which could be another reason why you don't see them racing now, because at the end of the day, these 495s were just too much bike and far too fiery to tame. Okay, so coming up next here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, we're going to take a very quick look at this vintage twin-port 250 Jawa, another super rare machine that's still being used as a weekend race bike. So make sure that you either subscribe or even return to my channel to take a look at this very rare machine. But for the time being, thanks again for tuning in, and it's cheerio for now from Classic Dirt Bike TV.